Time for Family Matters, and we're back in the education space today. I want to talk about the subject of when a learner should repeat a grade versus progressing, even if they haven't technically passed the previous grade, and the many convoluted issues that attach to this question, because it's not a simple black and white answer as to which is the better option. In fact, it's a pretty fraught subject that balances academic outcomes with social concerns, with the realities of classroom sizes and constrained resources in our schools. A really multi-pronged subject, and to explore some of those nuances, I'm delighted to have with us via Zoom this afternoon Ros Clayton, who is a researcher at Stellenbosch University in something called Research on Socio-Economic Policy, which is a cluster of multidisciplinary researchers coming at various policy issues, including educational equity. And Ros, it's great to have you on the show this afternoon. Welcome to CapeTalk.
Thanks for having me, Pippa.
Let's just start by reminding listeners what the current policy is, because the Department of Basic Education gives very clear guidelines on what is and isn't allowed in terms of the repetition of grades. And the last time I checked, and please just correct me if I'm wrong, but a learner is only allowed to repeat a grade once per phase, and the phases obviously covering sort of roughly 3 years each, from foundation phase to intermediate to senior and then FET phase. And if they are haven't managed to progress despite having repeated, they tend to be pushed up. Is that still the case, Ros?
Yes, that is the case, Pippa. In South Africa, we have quite clear guidelines on promotion policy where learners need to achieve certain marks in each grade, it's outlined, in order to be promoted. And that's there in a large part to uphold standards. However, there also needs to be a response to extensive repetition, or where a learner is repeating multiple times, and we do have that alongside the grade promotion policy, which requires a learner to repeat at most once per schooling phase. South Africa has this challenging education situation where there are learning deficits throughout the schooling system, and repetition is arising in response to those learning challenges. But as you mentioned, it has its own repercussions. Having a learner repeat the grade, they have to spend an extra year in school. It can be difficult for them psychologically. And not only that, it increases class sizes and it's very expensive for the government. It also,
there's the social aspect of you not wanting, too big an age gap in the same classroom of, a learner who's repeating for a second or third time is going to be significantly older than the cohort with them. But Ros, of course, the knee-jerk reaction to the policy of saying we don't want learners repeating more than once is, then what happens if a learner who really by rights shouldn't be progressing, who hasn't met the criteria to move up, is progressed anyway? They're then sitting perhaps out of their depth academically. The teacher who has them in their classroom has pressure to spend more time helping them cope. That potentially impacts the other learners in the classroom. It's a very, very complex situation on all sides. I believe there is new research, though, from the latest reading panel survey, which gives us a little bit more nuance into our understanding of this. Would you like to tell us a bit more about what that survey has told us?
Yes, so it's actually really difficult to get at the impact of grade repetition because the characteristics that lead a learner to repeat the grade, poor mastery of content, perhaps difficulties at home, behavioral issues, these characteristics also are what can lead the learner to struggle later on. So it's really difficult to understand the role of repetition separate from those characteristics that lead a learner to repeat. And that is why a lot of the evidence on repetition finds it to be associated with negative outcomes. But this new research contributes a more clear picture on the role that repetition itself plays for learners by using a method called regression discontinuity design. And that involves focusing on learners just around the promotion thresholds, those just below and just above, because these learners should be the same in all characteristics aside from whether or not they repeat the grade. And that allows us to get more closely at the impact of repetition itself. And what this research has found is that for those learners, repetition is helping them to develop their content knowledge. And those repeating learners do significantly better than the learners who were just promoted in the subsequent few grades. So that feeds into the narrative that you mentioned of teachers finding it difficult when learners are progressed, because repetition is supporting learners to master content to a greater extent.
Ros, on the other hand, the people who then gets progressed without having access to the year of repetition to embed that knowledge and help them overcome the challenges that they were facing. In a perfect world, of course, we'd like to say, okay, they must move forward, they move up with their class, but there should then be additional support offered to help them cope in what is now effectively a deeper swimming pool they've got to swim in. Is that happening, though, in practice, knowing the constraints on our schooling system and the overcrowding, the supply of teachers? There's so many factors you've already touched on there. What is becoming of those pupils who are progressed when ideally they probably should have had access to a repeated year?
We don't necessarily have good system-wide data on what happens to those learners, but there is some smaller qualitative data that suggests that these learners are not being well supported. But that being said, I do understand, just because repetition is playing a role doesn't mean that it is the best way of supporting learners, or it's definitely not the only way, and it doesn't mean it's the most cost-effective way. So the link to literacy is that in grade 1, 95% of learners who fail grade 1 are failing their home language. So that repetition is a response to a learning difficulty. And it is clearly important and is clearly supporting those learners. And I think what that adds to the policy debate, it can't really inform us too much about progression and holding learners back for multiple years. I think where it contributes to the policy debate is that repetition is playing a role. And if we want to reduce repetition, as has been discussed regarding the foundation phase, it absolutely needs to be replaced with some other proven effective support intervention, because this research shows it's not only draining resources or punishing learners for not meeting the thresholds, it is supporting learners. And if we remove or reduce access to repetition, we need to replace it with some other support to address the learning deficits.
Now, I would imagine researchers like yourself and your colleagues at the Research on Socio-Economic Policy cluster at Stellenbosch are looking at what those alternatives might look like. Ros, just in our final couple of minutes, do you want to reflect on some of the considerations you think policymakers should be looking at as they try to balance these different needs of adequately supporting those who need the sort of remedial support and helping those learners to succeed versus also, being mindful of the needs of those learners who are progressing with more ease through the system? Anything you'd like to say about what the replacement might look like?
There are some large-scale studies looking at early literacy interventions. In particular, you get interventions called structured pedagogy, which is basically supplying learning and teaching support materials as well as direct teacher support and coaching and clear lesson plans. So that is something that has been looked at on a large scale under the umbrella of Funda Wande, for example, or EGRS, Early Grade Reading Study. And those interventions are found to be effective in supporting early literacy. They don't produce the gains that were found in this repetition study, but of course they don't require a learner to spend a whole extra year in school. So there are interventions being looked at. It does remain a challenge as to how to scale those interventions. But I think providing early literacy support and reducing the need for repetition is definitely a key here.
And once again, brings us to that issue that we put so much focus at the end output of the education system, the matric pass rate, when where the focus is really needed is at the very beginning in that foundational phase that we set those learners up for success from day one. Ros, a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for joining us on the show this afternoon. We appreciate your time.
Thanks, Pippa.
Ros Clayton, researcher and PhD candidate at Stellenbosch University's Research on Socio-Economic Policy.